The snow had been falling for 6 hours when the train finally slowed at Colder Creek, and Ray Jordan stood in the aisle of the second car with her trunk at her feet and her hands folded at her waist and looked through the fogged window at the platform, which was not so much a platform as 4 boards nailed to posts above the mud, and at the man standing on it in a canvas coat that had seen better days than this one. And she thought, with the particular clarity that comes to a person who has already lost most of what she valued, that this was going to require a great deal more than she had packed. She had packed a good deal. 3 years earlier, in the fall of 1880, a late-season drought and a broken water wheel had finished what 2 hard winters had started on the Jordan family's homestead outside Ord, Nebraska. Her father had held the note himself, which meant there was no bank to negotiate with, only the land itself, and the land eventually paid what it owed by being sold to a wheat operation out of Omaha for 11 cents an acre. Her mother had gone to live with a sister in Iowa. Her brother Emmett had gone west to find work on the railroad. Ray had gone to Lincoln, where she taught school for 2 years, in a building that smelled of coal smoke and wet wool. And she had been good at it, and she had been desperately lonely in a way that had nothing to do with the number of children in a room. The matrimonial advertisement placed by Clement Hale in the Lincoln Journal had been honest about some things. It named the territory, Montana. It named the season, late autumn. It listed what was wanted: a capable woman, practical-minded, willing to work, not afraid of cold. It did not name the debt. It did not name the child. Ray, who was 28 years old and thorough by habit, had read the advertisement 3 times before she answered it, and she had told herself she was going west with clear eyes. She had been right about the cold. He had not told her about the $430 owed to the feed supplier. He had not told her there was a 9-year-old girl watching from behind the curtain in the front room of the house that morning when Ray climbed down from the depot wagon into 6 inches of fresh snow and looked at the two of them, the silent man and the silent child, and understood that the advertisement had left out the most significant items. Clement Hale was 34, broad across the shoulders with a rancher's worn hands and the face of a man who had learned that conversation cost more than it was usually worth. He had a 320-acre spread above the Colder Creek bottomland, 60 head of cattle going into the winter, a hip-roofed barn that needed 1 wall replaned, and a debt to Silas Pratt's feed operation that had grown over 2 lean summers into something he could not quietly absorb. His first wife, Clara, had died of fever 18 months earlier. The advertisement had been written out of necessity, not sentiment, and he had not spent much time worrying about what he left out, because he had assumed that any woman answering a Montana matrimonial advertisement already understood the general terms of the frontier. Ray understood the general terms. What she had not been told was the specific arithmetic. She stood in his front room that first afternoon with her coat still on and her trunk still by the door, and asked him plainly what he owed and to whom. He told her, after a pause that lasted approximately as long as a man who does not enjoy disclosure can make it last. She said, "That changes the terms." He said he expected it might. She said she had come from a homestead operation. She named the county, the acreage, the head of cattle her father had run, the feed calculation she had watched him make every October for 12 years before the drought ended it. She told him she had not answered an advertisement for a posting in a solvent household, because she had not wanted a solvent household. She had wanted a working one, but she had expected to know the full weight of the work before she agreed to carry it. He considered this for a moment. Then he said there was a child. Ray looked at the curtain, which had been moving slightly for 10 minutes. "I know," she said. Dora came around the curtain edge at a deliberate pace that told Ray everything about what the girl had decided to think of this situation, before it had properly begun. She was 9 years old, small, dark-haired, with her father's way of looking at a person as though she were measuring board feet. She did not say hello. She looked at Ray's trunk, then at Ray's hands, then at Ray's face. And Ray held still under the inspection the way you hold still when a new animal decides whether you're dangerous. "You're not what I thought you'd be," Dora said. Ray said, "Neither is this house." Dora considered this and then went back around the curtain, which Ray later decided was the closest thing to approval she was going to receive for some time. The negotiations that followed that evening were conducted at the kitchen table over cold cornbread and coffee that had been on the stove since morning. Ray learned that the $430 debt to Silas Pratt had accrued over 18 months of drought years and a bad calf season, and that Pratt had been patient about it in the way of a man who expects to be paid by other means eventually, specifically by acquiring the lower 20 acres of the Hale spread, at a price he would set himself. Clement had not said this to Pratt directly, and Pratt had not said it to him. But both men understood the shape of the thing. Ray understood it too, within 15 minutes of hearing the figure, because she had watched the same shape forming over her father's land before the end came. She told Clement she would stay through the winter. She told him the arrangement described in the advertisement was not yet settled, because he had advertised one thing and delivered another, and because she had described herself in her reply as a schoolteacher, without mentioning that she had grown up on 60 acres of Nebraska cattle land and knew more about winter feed management than most men who had been ranching since before she was born. She said they were therefore even on the matter of incomplete truths. He did not argue with this. She said she would make her decision about the permanent arrangement in the spring, when she had seen what the operation was and what it could become. Clement said he reckoned that was fair. She reckoned it was too. If you've ever known anyone who started something they thought was going to be one kind of life and slowly discovered it was an entirely different and better one, leave a comment below and tell us about it. There are people here who understand exactly what you mean. The first 2 weeks were a study in parallel motion. Clement worked the barn and the fences. Ray learned the house, then the feed shed, then the herd. She walked the pasture lines in her first week, which surprised him, and she counted the bales by hand, which surprised him more. And she came back to the kitchen that evening and sat down across from him and told him he was going to run out of hay before February if he did not reduce the daily feed rate by 1/3 and bring the cattle down from the upper pasture before the next hard storm. He started to explain the grazing pattern he had used for 5 years. She let him finish and then told him what the bale count said, regardless of the pattern. He looked at the number she had written on the back of a flour sack and didn't say anything for a while. He changed the feed rate the following morning. Dora watched all of this from her careful distance. She watched Ray in the kitchen, and she watched Ray in the yard, and she watched Ray speaking to her father in the flat, even tone that Ray used when she had already decided something was true and was simply informing the other party. Dora hadn't had a woman in the house since her mother died, and she was not sure yet what this woman was for. One afternoon in the second week, Ray found her in the barn, trying to lift a water bucket that was too heavy for her small frame, and Ray did not offer to lift it for her or make a remark about it. She just picked up one end, and Dora picked up the other, and they carried it to the trough together, and that was how they split the water detail for the rest of the winter without ever having a conversation about it. November gave way to December, and the cold deepened the way Montana cold deepens. Not suddenly, but relentlessly. The temperature dropping a few degrees each week until the air itself seemed to have weight. Ray sent a letter to her brother Emmett in November, telling him where she was, which was the first letter she had written in some months. and she did not make it sound better than it was. She wrote that the ranch needed work and the man was quieter than a fence post but appeared to mean well, and that there was a girl who reminded her of herself at that age in the specific quality of her suspicion. She sealed the letter and gave it to the depot man on her next trip to town for salt and lamp oil, and felt, when she handed it over, something ease slightly in her chest, as though naming the place had made it real, in a way that arriving in it had not quite managed. The town of Colder Creek was small and situated at the confluence of a creek and a freight road, with a general goods store, Pratt's feed operation, a post office sharing space with a harness shop, and a saloon that also served as the informal community meeting ground on Saturday evenings. Ray met Silas Pratt for the first time in early December, when she went in to pay a partial settlement against the debt and to establish what remained. Pratt was 50 years old, red-faced in the way of a man who has spent decades outdoors and indoors in roughly equal measure. And he had a way of looking at a woman who conducted business as though the situation required a moment of quiet adjustment on his part before he could proceed. He adjusted. He took the $50 partial payment and wrote the receipt and said, to no one in particular but in Ray's full hearing, that Clem Hale had done an interesting thing bringing a woman out here in November, and he hoped it worked out. Ray said she hoped so too, and left. She told Clement about the exchange that evening. He said Silas Pratt had been offering hope in that particular tone for as long as he had known him, and it generally meant the opposite. In early January, Pratt made his position clear in more public terms. A Saturday gathering at the saloon, with perhaps a dozen men from the surrounding spreads, turned to the topic of the Hale operation when someone asked Clement how the winter was going. Clement said it was going. Pratt said it was going to be interesting to see how long the arrangement held, since, in his experience, women who came out on matrimonial agreements in good weather tended to reconsider once the ground froze solid and the nearest neighbor was 3 miles away through drifts. He said he would bet $1 against the arrangement lasting to thaw. He said this with the even, almost gentle delivery of a man who believes he is being realistic rather than cruel. And several of the other men present laughed, and Clement said nothing and rode home. He told Ray what had been said. He was not certain why he told her. He did not tell her in order to alarm her or to encourage her to prove Pratt wrong, because he had not yet thought through what he wanted from any of this. He told her because she had been honest with him about the feed count and the partial payment and the letter to her brother. And it had become his habit over the past 6 weeks to match her honesty with his own, which was still a new and slightly uncomfortable habit, but one he had begun to find he preferred to the alternative. Ray heard the account of Pratt's wager and said, "He's betting on a pattern he has seen before." Clement said that was probably right. She said, "He hasn't seen me before." She did not say it as a boast. She said it the same way she had said the bail count, as a simple accounting of available information. Clement looked at her across the kitchen table and felt, not for the first time, the mild vertigo of a man who expected one thing and received something else entirely, and who is still in the slow process of understanding that what he received was better. The deep biographical fact that Ray had not yet told him was this: the Nebraska homestead had not simply failed. Her father had gone to pieces in the final season, and Ray had managed the last cattle drive to market herself at the age of 22, moving 30 miles down a dry creek bed in a September heat that killed 2 animals before she got them to Ord. And she had bargained the price herself with the buyer, and she had brought the money home and given it to her father, and it had not saved the land, but it had paid the hands who deserved paying. She had never told anyone this, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she had found that telling it produced one of 2 reactions in people, and she preferred neither. They either doubted the account or they praised her in the tone reserved for people who have done something unexpected given their particular limitations. And both responses shared a common root she had no patience for. She told Clement on a Sunday evening in late January, when they had been sitting by the stove after supper, and Dora had gone to bed, and the wind outside was running hard from the northwest. She told it plainly, in the order it had happened. When she finished, Clement sat with his coffee for a while. He said, "Your father let you do that." She said, "My father was not in a position to stop me." He asked if the land had sold to the wheat operation before or after she made the drive. She said before. She said the money from the drive had gone to pay the hands because the land sale had not covered wages and she would not leave debts like that behind her. He was quiet for a long time. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved over the roof in long, uneven runs. He said, "I wrote the advertisement the way I did because I was afraid a full account would keep anyone from coming." She said she had suspected that. He said the debt to Pratt was his fault entirely, from 2 bad decisions about summer grazing in years, when he should have sold more cattle and kept fewer, and that he had been hoping a wife might somehow improve his luck along with the rest of his circumstances. Ray said luck was a poor business plan. He said he was beginning to understand that. She looked at him across the stove, at the particular quality of his stillness, which she had initially read as emptiness and had come to understand was simply the habit of a man who had stopped expecting to be understood and was therefore not sure what to do when it happened. The grief that had been in her chest since Ord, Nebraska, the long, dull weight of it, loosened in some way she could not name precisely but recognized as significant. She said, "I'm not leaving in the spring." He did not say anything. He looked at the stove. After a while, he said, "I didn't think you were." She didn't know if he was telling the truth. She thought he probably was. The February blizzard arrived on the 8th, which was a Thursday, and it arrived without the usual warning signs that an experienced rancher expects, because the temperature had been unseasonably moderate for 4 days prior, and the sky on Wednesday evening had been clear enough to show stars. Clement had taken the wagon out at first light Thursday to move a salt block to the coulee pasture, where 60 head had drifted over the previous 2 days, grazing the dry grass on the south-facing slope below the ridge. The blizzard came in from the northwest at mid-morning, horizontal and without apology, and it came in fast. Ray was in the feed shed when the sky changed. She stood in the doorway and watched the light go from pale winter gray to the specific flat white that means business. And she went back to the house and put on everything she owned that could be layered, and then went to the barn for the horse. She found Clement at the edge of the coulee at 10:30, which took her longer than it should have because the snow was already knee-deep in the low spots, and the horse did not want to move into it with any conviction. He was on the ground beside the wagon with his left leg at an angle that answered all immediate questions about the wagon's front wheel, which had dropped into a frozen creek channel that the snow had hidden. The horse was still in the traces, eyes wide and snorting. The cattle were in the coulee behind the wagon, 60 head bunched against the downwind slope, which was the wrong slope, and the temperature was dropping as she watched. She got down and looked at his leg. He had gotten his belt around his thigh to slow the bleeding from a gash where the wheel rim had caught him, and his face had the gray-white color of a man managing significant pain at some cost to the rest of his faculties. He said, "Get the cattle up." She said, "First things first." She got the wagon braces from the bed and set his leg against the longest one with his belt and a length of harness strap she cut from the traces, and he said several things during this process that Dora later claimed she had heard from inside the house, through the wind, which was almost certainly not true, but became family legend regardless. When the leg was braced, she got him into the wagon bed with the blanket from behind the seat and told him to stay still. And he said he was not planning to dance. And she took the saddle horse and went back for the cattle. Moving 60 head of cattle alone in a 3-day blizzard is not a single act so much as a sustained argument conducted in the language of noise, position, and determined physical presence. Ray knew this language. She had learned it on the Nebraska Drive, and she had been refreshing her knowledge since November by watching this particular herd learn her voice, her horse's movement, her way of holding position on the flank. The cattle did not want to move. The wind came at them head-on from the upper pasture, and their instinct was to turn away from it and drift, which would take them deeper into the coulee and into the kind of cold that kills 60 head before dawn. She pushed them up. She lost feeling in her feet on the first hour. She lost feeling in her hands on the second. She kept the horse moving because stopping was the only choice she would not make. And the horse, which was a 12-year-old bay gelding with more sense than most of the men in Colder Creek, seemed to understand this and moved when she asked without being asked twice. The cattle moved in fits and starts, the leaders finding the trail up from the coulee and the rear bunching and crowding until the whole mass of them was pushing uphill out of sheer collective pressure. And by late afternoon of the first day, all 60 head were in the upper pasture behind the windbreak ridge where the hay was stacked. She went back to Clement twice that first day, once to bring him food and once to make sure the leg had not worsened. He was holding. He was cold and in pain, and he hated being in the wagon bed, but he was holding. On the second visit, he tried to tell her something about the cattle, and she told him the cattle were in the upper pasture. He looked at her for a long time through the snow coming off the wagon canvas. He said, "All 60. She said, "All 60. He closed his eyes. After a moment, he said, "Clara couldn't have done that," Ray said. "Clara wasn't here. It was not unkind. It was just the fact of it." She pulled the canvas back across and went to check the horse. The blizzard ran 3 full days, the way the worst ones do, spending itself down to a gray skitter of wind-driven ice by the morning of the 11th. Dora had kept the house and the fire, and had not once come outside after the first morning, which Ray had specifically instructed before she rode out on Thursday. And when Ray came in through the back door on Sunday morning with ice in her hair and both hands wrapped in feed sacking she had cut from the barn, Dora was standing at the stove with coffee already poured. She did not say anything. She handed Ray the coffee and stood close while Ray's hands thawed, and the color came back into her face. And when Ray started to cry, which surprised Ray more than it surprised anyone else in the room, Dora put a hand on her arm and kept it there until the moment passed. Ray dried her face on her sleeve and said, "Your father needs moving." Dora said, "I know. I'll get his coat." That was the first time Ray understood that the household had become a family, and she thought it without ceremony, the way you know a thing that was always going to be true eventually. Clement was moved into the house, and his leg was set properly, or as properly as the resources available allowed, which meant braced firmly against a straight-cut board from the woodpile and bound with strips from a flour sack boiled clean, and he was given a crutch Ray fashioned from a forked branch that Dora found under the woodpile lean-to. And he was put in his own bed, and he stayed there for the better part of 2 weeks, which was the longest he had been horizontal since Clara's funeral, and which he found approximately as comfortable as Ray had predicted he would. He asked Ray to bring him the deed box on the 3rd day of his recovery. She brought it. He told her what was in it, which was the deed to the 320 acres, and the water rights agreement with the territorial office, and a promissory note for the balance of the feed debt, which stood at $380 after the partial payment in December. He asked Ray to sit down. She sat. He said he wanted to add her name to the deed before the circuit preacher came through, not after, because he wanted it to be clear that the gesture was not part of the ceremony. He said it was what the operation warranted, based on what she had done and what she clearly intended to continue doing, and he was not a man who liked owing debts that could be settled by paper. Ray said, "Half." He said he had been thinking a quarter. She said the upper pasture and the hay and the 60 head still alive in February argued for half. He thought about it. He said, "Half." She said yes. The circuit preacher, a lean man named Aldred who traveled a 4-county circuit on a gray horse and performed marriages, funerals, and occasional arbitrations with equal economy of expression, arrived on the 24th of February. He performed the ceremony in the front room with Dora standing beside the stove in her good dress and the bay gelding visible through the window, nose deep in the water trough now that the ice had been broken for the morning. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Aldred had coffee and corn cake and was back on his gray horse before noon. Dora said afterward that it was the shortest wedding she had ever seen. Ray said it was the only one she had ever been in. Dora thought about this and said that probably made it the best one by default. And Ray looked at her and felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled there before, warm and unassuming and entirely real. By the first week of March, Clement was on the crutch. By the third week, he was working the yard, slow and irritable about the slowness in equal measure. Ray ran the feed and the herd through the remainder of winter without discussion, because she was already running them and there was no reason to stop. And when the grass came up in April and the creek ran clear, and the 60 head moved out to the spring pasture fat and whole, there was no conversation between Ray and Clement about who had kept them alive through February. Some things did not need saying. The debt to Silas Pratt stood at $380 when the snow went. Ray had kept the books through the winter, a fact that Clement had acknowledged by placing the account ledger on her side of the kitchen table in early February and not retrieving it. And she had identified 2 places where the previous year's accounts had been managed in the way of a man who is good with cattle and less good with columns of numbers. She did not say this to Clement. She simply corrected the columns and showed him the corrected figures, and he looked at them for a while and said he had evidently been paying Pratt about $40 more than he owed over the past year and a half. She said it appeared so. He said he imagined Pratt had not noticed. She said she imagined Pratt had noticed fine. They settled the corrected figure in full on the 14th of April. $340, not $380. The difference accounted for in Ray's written reconciliation, which she presented to Pratt across his counter with the payment. Pratt looked at the reconciliation for some time. He looked at the payment. He wrote the receipt and slid it across the counter and said nothing further, and Ray took the receipt and said good morning and walked out into the April sun. She rode home with the receipt in her coat pocket and did not mention to Clement that Pratt had not offered the usual pleasantries, because Pratt's silence was its own complete sentence and required no translation. Clement was splitting wood in the yard when she rode in. He looked up. She held up the receipt. He nodded once and went back to splitting, which was the right response, and she put the horse up and went to start the noon meal, and Dora came in from the pasture fence where she had been watching the cattle and left her muddy boots at the door without being asked, which was a new development and a welcome one. The wager Silas Pratt had made in the saloon that January was never formally settled. No one came to collect from him, and he made no acknowledgment of the outcome. The men who had been present at the Saturday gathering had their own knowledge of what the spring had produced, and they drew their own conclusions quietly, the way communities do when they would rather revise their expectations than account for the distance between those expectations and events. Pratt himself became, over subsequent years, one of the Hale operation's more reliable suppliers, attending to their account with a scrupulousness that some people in Colder Creek attributed to good business sense and others attributed to other things, and the truth was probably a mixture. What you have to understand is that the best things that came out of Colder Creek in the years that followed were not sudden. They accumulated the way hay does in a good summer, stack by stack, until the barn is full and what seemed like a shortage in the fall of one year looks like abundance in the spring of the next. Clement's leg healed clean, which the doctor from the county seat later told him was something of an event given how it had been set, and he credited Ray's management of it without embarrassment, which was the kind of man he had become. He took back the heavier ranch work through the summer of 1884, and Ray took the books and the herd management and the matter of Dora's schooling, which she handled herself at the kitchen table 3 mornings a week when the weather kept Dora in, using a method that combined the standard primers from the territorial office with a mathematics curriculum she had largely invented herself, and which Dora found she did not hate, a reaction Ray considered sufficient. By the fall of 1885, the Hale operation ran 90 head on 320 acres with no debt outstanding and a hay surplus that Clement sold to 2 neighboring ranches at a rate that covered the winter supply costs entirely. Ray had found a parlor organ at the estate sale of a Colder Creek family moving to Oregon, a small instrument with 3 stuck keys and a set of bellows that needed patching, and she had it brought out to the ranch on the freight wagon and repaired what needed repairing herself. And on Sundays when the weather permitted, she played it in the front room while Dora sat on the settee and Clement read. And the sound of it moved through the house and out the windows and into the yard, where it was swallowed by the wind and the creek noise and the ordinary sounds of a working ranch going about its business. They had 2 sons, Thomas and Walter, born in 1886 and 1888. Dora, who had been prepared to view this development with her characteristic skepticism, decided instead that brothers were tolerable if managed correctly, and she managed them with a firm hand from the beginning, which was the only method that had any effect. Dora grew up on that ranch and married a cattleman from the Judith Basin, and eventually ran 300 acres of her own, which had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with how she was raised. Thomas went to Missoula for school and came back to the valley with a law degree and an interest in water rights, which proved useful in ways no one had specifically anticipated. Walter stayed on the home ranch, which by 1910 had expanded to 600 acres through 2 additional purchases, and he ran it with the same flat practical attention to the feed count and the bale tally that his mother had brought to it a quarter-century earlier. Ray Jordan Hale played the parlor organ every Sunday for 31 years, until the winter of 1914, when her hands grew stiff enough that the cold mornings were too much for the joints, and she played it still in the milder weather until 1918, when Clement died in April, and she stopped for a while, and then started again in the fall, because the house was very quiet without it. She died in 1923 at the age of 68, in the same house she had walked into with her coat still on in November of 1883, and they buried her on the hillside above the upper pasture, beside Clement, in the place she had chosen herself, because you could see the whole valley from there, the bottomland and the creek and the hay pasture, and, on a clear day, the ridge above the coulee where she had pushed 60 head through 3 days of horizontal snow with nothing but a 12-year-old bay horse and the particular refusal specific to her to stop. The grave marker gave her name in full, Rachel Emmeline Jordan Hale. Beneath the name it gave the year of her birth and the year of her death, and nothing else, because the valley itself was the rest of the account, and anyone standing on that hillside in the spring, looking down at the green creek bottom and the white-faced cattle in the lower pasture, already knew the arithmetic. The organ is still in the front room. Dora's granddaughter has it now, the bellows long since replaced, and the 3 stuck keys long since freed, and she plays it on Sunday mornings when the family comes for the noon meal, and the sound of it moves through the house and out the windows just the way it did in 1884. And if anyone happens to be standing in the yard when it starts up, they can hear it all the way to the barn. If this story stayed with you the way it has stayed with us, leave a word below about someone you know who showed up in the wrong season and turned out to be exactly right. And if you want another story about the kind of person the frontier kept underestimating, stay right here. There is one more waiting.